Welcome to Timeless Dreams. Subscribe, relax, and drift into sleep with the gentle stories of history. Close your eyes. Let the day drift quietly behind you. You've made it here, to this moment, where nothing is expected of you except to listen and let the gentle rhythm of a story carry you into sleep. Tonight, I'll take you far away from the noise of the present, to a time when gods still walked among mortals, and the sea whispered secrets to anyone patient enough to hear them. Breathe slowly, in and out. Imagine the world growing dim around you, as if the sun itself has tucked you under a blanket of twilight. Somewhere in that fading light, a voice from the past is calling, soft, like a lullaby woven into the air. That is where our story begins. Long before the empires you know from history, before marble cities rose under the command of kings, there was an island adrift in the warm blue waters of the Aegean Sea. The people there had no great armies, no need for walls. Their days were simple, filled with fishing, weaving, and telling stories beneath olive trees that had stood for hundreds of years. It was on this island, in the quiet village of Alathos, that a girl named Irene was born. Her name meant peace, and for much of her life, it seemed the gods had honored that name. She had hair the color of wheat at the height of summer, and eyes the pale green of new leaves. Yet it was not her beauty the villagers spoke of most. It was the way she listened. Irene could hear things others could not. The low hum of the earth before rain came, the shift of the tide before a storm, and once, when she was a child, she claimed to have heard the voice of a god carried in the wind. Most dismissed it as fancy, but her grandmother, who had grown up on the same island, only smiled knowingly. "The old ones still walk here," she would say. "You just have to know how to hear them." One summer evening, as the day folded into a gold and rose-colored dusk, Irene wandered down to the cove where fishermen mended their nets. That is where she first saw him, Aryan. He was not like the other young men of the island. There was a restlessness about him, as though his soul belonged somewhere just out of reach. His hair was dark, his eyes deep and steady, and when he looked at the horizon, it was as if he were waiting for it to answer him back. The two spoke little at first, a passing word about the weather, a shared glance when dolphins chased fish into the bay. But there was an unspoken thread between them, a pull neither could name. Days turned into weeks, and their conversations grew longer. Aryan told her of his dreams, of far-off lands and ancient places he had never seen, but felt he somehow knew. Irene told him about the strange things she heard in the world, whispers in the olive groves, the sigh of the sea when the moon was high. It might have gone on that way forever, two young souls wrapped in the quiet rhythm of the island, if not for what happened on the night of the Festival of Lamps. Every year, the villagers would honor the sea god with a procession. Lanterns made of paper and reed would be lit and set adrift, carrying prayers over the water. That year, as music echoed off the cliffs and the air was sweet with figs and wine, Irene and Aryan stood at the edge of the shore, their lanterns glowing softly in their hands. But when they set theirs upon the waves, something strange happened. Instead of drifting with the others, their lanterns circled each other, once, twice, before floating toward a darker part of the bay. The music faded in Irene's ears. She felt the air grow still, as if the whole island were holding its breath. Then, from somewhere out beyond the lantern light, came a sound, low, almost like the voice of the tide, but too deliberate, too knowing. Aryan's hand found hers. They both knew it was calling them. From that night on, their dreams were no longer their own. Aryan dreamt of a white-sailed ship gliding over endless waters toward a place of golden cliffs. Irene dreamt of a silver crown lying at the bottom of the sea, and a voice telling her that peace, her gift, would one day be tested. Neither could explain it, yet both felt it. Something had been set in motion, the kind of something the old myths were made of. As the seasons turned, the signs grew harder to ignore. A sudden storm that tore through the fishing boats, sparing only the one Aryan worked upon. A grove of olive trees blooming out of season where Irene had been sitting the night before. And always, that same distant voice, whispering between the waves. But here, dear listener, I must slow the telling. Because myths are not meant to be rushed. They arrive in the mind like the tide. First gentle, then deeper, until you find yourself carried far from where you began. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, we will follow Irene and Aryan into a world where dreams bleed into reality, and the choices of mortals can stir the will of gods. And in that space between waking and dreaming, we will discover what the lanterns were trying to tell them, and why the sea itself had chosen to speak. For now, let the sound of the fire and the quiet rhythm of your breath take you deeper. The island of Elathos is waiting, and so are the old gods. Morning on Elathos began with the scent of salt and the slow creak of fishing boats returning to shore. The sea, still tinged with the pink light of dawn, was calm after a night of restless tides. Irene awoke to the sound of gulls calling over the rooftops, their wings catching the early sun like scraps of white silk. She dressed quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind of cool that carries the promise of heat later in the day. Beyond the narrow path lined with rosemary bushes, the village stirred awake. Women drawing water from the well, men unloading nets heavy with the morning's catch, children chasing each other barefoot in the dust. But Irene's mind was still with the dream she had left behind. She had been standing in a place she did not know, a shoreline of black stone where the waves glowed faintly as if lit from beneath. The silver crown lay there again, half buried in sand, and she could hear the voice, patient and insistent, telling her the same words it always did. Peace is not given. It is kept. She did not yet understand what it meant. That morning, Aryan was already at the cove, his boat pulled onto the sand for repairs. He greeted her with a quiet smile, as though the sight of her had been expected. They spoke of small things at first, the weather, the condition of the nets. But soon their words turned toward the festival night and the strange path their lanterns had taken. "I've been thinking about it," Aryan said, running his fingers along the wood of the boat. "The tide that night. It shouldn't have carried them that way." "You think it was a sign?" Irene asked. He hesitated. "I think something was calling to us." The words hung between them like a secret neither wanted to say too loudly, in case the sea was listening. By midday, the village was alive with the rhythm of daily life. Fishermen repaired sails in the shade. The blacksmith's hammer rang faintly from the edge of town, and the smell of baking bread drifted from clay ovens. Yet even in this ordinary bustle, both Irene and Aryan felt it. The quiet hum beneath the world, as though the island itself was holding some deep, unspoken truth. That afternoon, a trader's boat arrived from the mainland, its deck stacked with jars of oil, bolts of dyed cloth, and baskets of pomegranates. Among the goods was something unusual, a rolled length of linen painted with intricate scenes. The trader explained it was a storyteller's cloth, depicting the journeys of heroes and the favors and punishments of the gods. Irene's eyes lingered on one panel in particular. It showed a young woman kneeling before a sea god, offering him a crown of silver. The waves curled around her in shapes that looked almost like hands. She asked the trader where the scene came from. "From a very old story," he said, lowering his voice as though it were not meant for all ears. "Of a mortal chosen by the god of the deep to carry peace between warring lands. But the choice was a curse as much as a gift. Many believe the tale is older than even the temples, older than the cities themselves." Irene felt her breath catch. The image was too close to her dreams to be coincidence. Later, as the sun slipped low and painted the horizon in gold, she walked alone to the cove. The tide was coming in, each wave curling and breaking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She closed her eyes, listening. At first there was only the sound of water, but then it came. A voice low and steady, woven into the pulse of the sea. Irene. Her eyes flew open. The shore was empty. The crown must be found. The words faded into the hiss of the waves, leaving only her racing heartbeat. That night, she told Aryan what she had heard. He didn't laugh, didn't doubt her. Instead, he nodded as if it confirmed something he had felt all along. "I think," he said slowly, "this is only the beginning." Outside, the moon hung over Elathos, casting a silver path across the water that seemed to lead straight into the unknown. The morning after the voice in the tide, the island's air carried a different weight. It wasn't heavier in a way one could measure, but in the same subtle manner a room feels altered after a whisper is spoken in it. Irene walked the path to the cove before the sun fully crested the hills. A pale mist clung to the rosemary and thyme along the way, and her sandals brushed over stones still damp from the night's dew. She found Aryan sitting on the edge of his repaired boat, running a whetstone over the edge of a small blade. He greeted her without surprise, as though he had known she would come. "I kept thinking about what you heard," he said quietly. "About the crown. I can't explain it," she admitted. "But the words felt not like they were spoken to me, but as if they were already part of me." Aryan nodded, his gaze fixed on the water beyond the cove. "When I was a boy, my grandfather told me the sea speaks to certain people, not always in words, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in signs. He said the sea remembers, even when people forget." They fell into silence, listening to the slow pull and push of the tide. The sound seemed different today, less random, more like breathing. By midday, the village was preparing for the autumn market, when traders from other islands would arrive to barter for fish, olives, wine, and wool. Irene's family home smelled of herbs and lemon as her mother wrapped bundles of thyme to sell. But even as she worked, Irene's mind kept returning to the linen painting from the day before. The mortal woman before the sea god, the silver crown gleaming in her hands. That afternoon, she and Aryan made their way to the hilltop shrine. It was one of the oldest places on Elathos, a ring of weathered stones overlooking the western horizon. No priest tended it now, yet offerings still appeared there from time to time. Seashells arranged in spirals, clay cups of wine, feathers from seabirds. The climb was quiet. The sky was cloudless, the sea below glittering as if the sun itself had been scattered into pieces. When they reached the shrine, Irene placed a shell she had found that morning on the altar. Aryan set down a small carving of a fish he had whittled in his youth. They stood there, not praying in the way the elders taught, but simply listening. The wind moved through the stones, carrying a faint scent of brine. Far below, a line of white waves broke against black rock, endlessly repeating. Then, just for a moment, the light on the water shifted. A band of silver shimmered not from the sun's position, but as though rising from the depths themselves. Aryan saw it too. "It's pointing," he whispered. The silver band extended toward the northwestern horizon, where a faint smudge of land barely showed above the water's edge. It was an isle neither had visited, one that fishermen spoke of only in passing, a place said to be surrounded by reefs and difficult to reach. By the time the shimmer faded, the image of that far-off isle was imprinted in both their minds. That evening, the harbor grew quiet after the last of the day's work was done. Lamps flickered in doorways, and the scent of baking bread drifted from kitchens. Irene and Aryan sat by the shore, the small waves catching the lamplight in brief flashes. "I think that's where it begins," Aryan said at last. "Whatever this is, the voice, the crown, it wants us to go there." Irene traced a fingertip through the damp sand. "And if we find it?" He looked out toward the horizon. "Then we'll know why the sea hasn't let go of us." Above them, the first stars appeared, each one reflected on the black surface of the water until it seemed as though the sky and the sea were mirrors facing one another. Somewhere between them, in that invisible space, the old story waited. The following days passed in a quiet that felt deliberate, as though the island itself were pausing to listen. The marketplace bustled with voices and barter, but Irene and Aryan carried the image of that distant isle in the back of their minds, like a song they could not quite stop humming. By day, they moved through their usual work. Irene helped her mother sort herbs for drying, the scent of sage and oregano lingering on her fingers long after the baskets were empty. Aryan mended nets for an elder fisherman, knotting rope with a rhythm that seemed older than the village itself. Yet in the spaces between these tasks, in the walks from one place to another, in the stillness before sleep, they felt the pull of the horizon. On the third evening, a change came. The sea's surface was unusually smooth, reflecting the rising moon in perfect silver. Aryan came to Irene's door after nightfall, holding a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were figs, bread, a small flask of water, and the carved fish from the shrine. "If we wait for perfect weather, we may never go," he said quietly. "But tonight feels open." Irene's pulse quickened, but she didn't argue. The idea of sailing into the unknown had always been more of a dream than a plan, yet now it stood before her, as plainly as the packed bundle in Aryan's hands. They walked together to the cove. The air was cool, carrying the faint cry of night birds. The repaired boat rested in the shallows, its wood darkened by the moon's reflection. Aryan pushed it gently into deeper water, holding it steady as Irene stepped in. The first stretch was easy. The tide seemed to carry them outward with little effort, the oars dipping into the water in slow, even strokes. The island's lights shrank behind them until they were no more than a scattering of warm sparks against the dark hills. Ahead, the faint outline of the distant isle grew sharper with each pull of the oars. It was not until they were halfway across that the water beneath them began to change. The surface shimmered faintly, not with the moon's reflection, but with its own inner light, as though something far below was glowing. The boat seemed to glide over a river of silver within the sea. Irene leaned over the side. Shapes moved in the glow, not fish exactly, but forms that seemed both liquid and solid, flowing yet defined. They swam alongside the boat for several moments before vanishing into the depths. They're leading us, Aryan murmured, his voice almost a whisper. When they finally neared the reef-laced shore of the mysterious isle, the air was filled with the scent of salt and something older, the faint, metallic tang of storms long past. The beach was narrow, bordered by dark stone cliffs. They pulled the boat onto the sand, the sound of wood scraping rock briefly breaking the quiet. Above the tide line, the ground was littered with shells unlike any they had seen on Elathos. Some were spiraled tightly, others shaped like open hands. Each one seemed polished, as if by centuries of care, gleaming softly under the moonlight. They followed a narrow path between the rocks, the sound of the sea fading behind them. After only a short walk, they found it, a pool of still water, perfectly round, reflecting the stars above with a clarity that made it seem deeper than the night sky itself. Irene stepped closer, feeling the pull of the place. The pool's edge was ringed with small carvings in the stone, symbols neither of them recognized. Aryan knelt and touched the water's surface. It rippled once, then stilled again, as if considering him. "I think this is where the voice began," Irene said softly. Aryan nodded. "And maybe where it will speak again." They waited in silence, the air thick with expectation. And then, as before, the words came, not from the air around them, but from within the water, curling through their minds like a tide. "The crown is lost, but not gone. Find it, and you will return what was promised." The words faded, leaving only the quiet sound of the night. Neither of them spoke. The meaning was still unclear, but the direction was certain. This was no longer just a dream. Far off, the first hint of dawn touched the edge of the horizon, and with it came the sense that their lives on Elathos had just become part of a larger story, one written long before they were born. The sun rose slowly over the waters, painting the cliffs of the strange isle in muted gold. Irene and Aryan stood at the pool's edge, watching as the pale light replaced the moon's silver glow. The carved symbols in the stone seemed to shift slightly under the morning light, as if the day itself was tracing them into memory. Neither spoke for some time. The message from the water, "The crown is lost, but not gone," echoed in their thoughts like the last note of a song that would not fade. "We can't return to Elathos and pretend we didn't hear it," Aryan said at last. His voice was calm, but steady with a decision that had already settled in his heart. Irene agreed silently. She bent down and touched the water. This time it did not speak. It was as though it had told them all it could for now, and was content to let them find their own way forward. They began to explore the isle, moving along narrow paths cut between the cliffs. Strange plants grew here, low to the ground, with silvery leaves that caught the light in a way that almost seemed to shimmer from within. In the air hung a faint hum, so soft that it might have been imagined, but it followed them wherever they went. On the far side of the isle, they found the remains of what must have once been a small harbor. Weathered stones marked the outlines of old piers, long since claimed by the sea. Among the rubble lay pieces of pottery, some painted with intricate spirals, others plain and unadorned. One shard bore the image of a crown, not the jagged metal kind worn by warlords in stories, but a delicate circlet of woven branches and leaves studded with smooth river stones. "It's not gold," Irene said, brushing sand from the painted fragment. "No," Aryan replied, "but maybe it's older than gold." They took the shard with them, tucking it into the cloth bundle. Something in it felt like a clue, not to where the crown was, but to what it was. As the day warmed, they returned to the pool. The still water reflected the clouds now drifting overhead, and the carvings seemed no less mysterious than before. Irene studied them closely, tracing one with her finger. It was shaped like a winding river, ending in a small circle. Another carving showed a figure with outstretched hands, holding what looked like a wreath of light. "I think this isn't just a place," she said. "It's part of a path, maybe the first step of it." Aryan looked toward the open sea. "If that's true, then the next step isn't here." The decision came quietly. They would leave the isle, not to abandon its mystery, but to follow the trail it had set before them. But before they went, they stood at the pool once more, as though saying goodbye to an old friend. The water was silent, yet there was a sense of acknowledgement in the way its surface rippled when the wind touched it. They launched the boat in the early afternoon. The tide had shifted, carrying them gently back toward the familiar outline of Elathos. The silver shapes that had swum beneath their hull on the journey out did not appear this time. It felt as if the isle had sent them on alone, trusting them to find the rest. By the time they reached their home shore, the sun was lowering toward evening. The village was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of baking bread and wood smoke. They did not speak of the isle to anyone, not yet. Instead, they returned to their work as though nothing had changed, though everything had. That night, Irene dreamed of the pool, but in her dream, it was not surrounded by cliffs. Instead, it lay in the middle of a vast plain of tall grass, the sky above it full of unfamiliar constellations. The crown from the shard floated just above the water's surface, turning slowly as though caught in a current only it could feel. When she woke, she told Aryan. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The crown is moving," he said, "and maybe so should we." The days ahead would carry them far from Elathos, into places where myth and memory blurred, and where the meaning of what was promised would begin to take shape. The following morning came slow and quiet, the kind of dawn where the mist clung to the earth as if it feared to let go. Irene and Aryan rose before the rest of the village, slipping out into the pale half-light without a word. They both knew the pool on the isle had given them a beginning, but beginnings, by their nature, demand a continuation. They decided to search their own island first. Elathos was small, but it carried more history than most of its people remembered. The oldest paths wound away from the clustered homes, past low stone walls, into the high inland hills where the air grew cooler and still. The first place they visited was the abandoned chapel on the ridge. No one had worshipped there for 3 generations. The roof had caved in, and moss grew thick along the altar's edge. Yet, behind the altar, carved into the wall, they found something that made them pause. The same winding river symbol they had seen at the pool, ending in the same small circle. Aryan ran his hand along the groove. "This isn't just a mark," he murmured. "It's part of something older. Older than the chapel, maybe older than the village." They lingered there, listening to the soft drip of water from the stones above. Then, almost as an afterthought, Irene noticed a second carving lower down. A small crown-like shape, made not of spikes, but of looping, interwoven arcs, as if it had been braided from vines. "It's the same crown," she whispered. From the ridge, they followed an overgrown path into the hills, guided less by any map and more by a pull they could not name. The path narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Eventually, it spilled into a small clearing surrounded by oak trees. At its center stood a flat stone, perfectly round, worn smooth as if countless hands had touched it. Irene placed the pottery shard with the painted crown on the stone. For a moment, the air seemed to grow warmer, though the wind still whispered through the leaves. It was not a sign they could read, but it felt like an acknowledgement, the kind that comes when you are moving in the right direction. As evening drew close, they returned to the village, but their steps slowed at the edge of the western cliffs. From there, the sea stretched endlessly, and in the fading light, the horizon seemed to shimmer faintly, as if holding a hidden shape. Aryan spoke first. If the crown is not gone, maybe it has moved across more than just distance. Maybe it's crossed into the places people think exist only in story. Irene didn't answer, but the thought rooted itself deeply. That night, she could not sleep. She wandered to the shoreline, where the moonlight made the waves silver. Standing there, she closed her eyes and listened. The sea was never truly silent, but beneath the hiss of the water, she heard it again, that faint hum they had first noticed on the isle. This time it seemed closer, curling around her thoughts like a half-remembered lullaby. She followed it along the beach, each step slow and careful. The sound led her to the mouth of a small cave, one she had never entered before. The tide was low, and moonlight reached just far enough inside to reveal that the walls were etched with carvings. Some were strange, but others were unmistakable. The winding river, the small circle, the braided crown. When Aryan found her there at dawn, she was sitting just inside, watching the light creep across the stone. She told him about the hum, the way it had guided her here. "We've been looking on land," he said, "but maybe the next step is beneath the sea." The idea unsettled them both, not in fear, but in the way all great shifts in a journey unsettle. The cave and its carvings felt like a door, and if they stepped through, they would no longer be searching close to home. For now, they decided to wait, to listen. The sea had its own way of telling things, and neither of them wished to rush it. Still, the shape of the path ahead was beginning to reveal itself, just faintly, like constellations coming into focus. The days that followed felt different, as though the island itself had begun to listen. The air carried a quiet expectancy, and the sea seemed to watch them with 1,000 unseen eyes. Irene and Aryan returned to the cave each morning. They brought small candles, placing them in shallow niches along the wall so the carvings flickered in the light. The more they studied them, the more they noticed. Subtle details almost hidden in the stone. The winding river lines were not all the same. Some bent sharply, some flowed in slow curves, and one seemed to spiral inward, ending in a circle marked with faint radiating lines. "It's not just a river," Aryan said one morning. "It's a path, but not one meant for land." They both knew what that implied. The spiral led inward, beneath, down into places the villagers spoke of only in fragments. That night, the wind shifted, coming from the south, bringing with it the scent of distant rain. Irene woke to the sound of the sea in motion, not the usual steady rhythm, but a pulsing, like breath. She rose and walked to the cliffs. The water below was dark, yet faint glimmers moved beneath the surface, as though the sea itself carried lanterns through its depths. Aryan joined her, silent for a while. Then he said, "It's calling us." The decision came without discussion. They would leave the next night under moonlight before the village could question them. It wasn't rebellion, it was inevitability. Some journeys ask permission, others begin the moment you hear their call. They prepared in the simplest way. Aryan borrowed his uncle's small fishing boat, sturdy but unadorned, its wood smelling of salt and years of use. Irene gathered a pouch of dried herbs from the healer's hut, not for food, but for offering. In old island custom, you did not cross into unknown waters without first giving the sea something of worth. The following night, the moon hung low and full, laying a silver road across the water. They pushed the boat from shore, its hull gliding silently over the shallows. The island receded quickly, until its lights were only faint sparks behind them. For hours they followed the silver path. The air was still, and the only sound was the dip of the oars. Now and then, a fish would break the surface, sending ripples like rings of glass across the moon's reflection. Far from land, the water changed. It grew darker, yet strangely clear, and beneath them Irene could see shapes moving, slow, deliberate forms, gliding far below. They were not fish, she knew. One had the long tail of a serpent, yet its body shimmered like hammered silver. Another coiled slowly, ringed with what looked like tiny lights. Neither of them spoke. Words would have felt clumsy in the presence of such silent grace. Sometime near midnight, they reached the place the carvings had suggested, a patch of water where the current curled inward, spiraling in a gentle, endless turn. Aryan set the oars down, letting the boat drift into its center. Irene took the pouch of herbs, loosened its tie, and let them scatter into the water. The scent of them, sweet, sharp, and green, rose into the night. The current caught the offering, carrying it downward. The sea stilled. Even the air seemed to pause. And then, from beneath, the glow began. Faint at first, like distant lightning through deep clouds. It grew slowly, until the entire spiral below them shimmered. Irene's heart beat slow but heavy. She could not tell if the glow was rising toward them or if they were sinking toward it. Time blurred. The night folded around them. In that moment, she understood something without knowing how. The crown they sought was not a thing of metal or jewels. It was older than both, and its shape could change. Sometimes it was worn, sometimes it was hidden, sometimes it was not an object at all, but a bond between people, between the land and the sea, between a promise and its keeper. The glow began to fade, leaving them in darkness once more. Yet the spiral of water remained, carrying them gently in its endless turning. Aryan broke the silence. "We're not done here. This isn't the end. It's the threshold." They let the boat drift until the first blush of dawn touched the horizon.
Then they turned back toward the island, bringing with them no treasure, no proof, only a deeper certainty that their journey had truly begun. The villagers would not see the difference in their eyes, but the sea would, and that was enough. The return to the island was quiet, not in the sense that no one noticed, but rather, no one asked. In places where old customs still breathed, silence was its own form of acknowledgement. Irene and Aryan walked the familiar sand in the early morning light. The tide was far out, exposing dark ribbons of seaweed and pools, where small crabs moved in slow, deliberate arcs. The air had the sharpness of salt and stone. They had no plans that day, yet both felt a pull toward the higher ground at the island's heart, a ridge crowned with wind-bent pines and scattered standing stones, worn almost to smoothness by time. It was a place neither had visited since childhood, when games and dares had led them scrambling up its slopes. Now it felt different. The path was narrow and uneven, winding between thickets of seagrass and wild heather. The wind here spoke in different tones, less the restless voice of the shore, more the slow, deep murmur of something that had been watching for centuries. As they climbed, the air seemed to thin, not from height but from age. The scent of the pines mingled with something older, a faint mineral tang, like the memory of rain on stone long after the clouds had gone. At the top they found the stones as they remembered them, though now they seemed to stand closer together, their lean shapes catching the light like sentinels. Moss clung thick to their bases, and faint carvings almost lost to erosion curved along their surfaces. Irene ran her fingers over one of them, tracing a shallow spiral. It reminded her of the water's curl from the night before. The shape was not identical, but it held the same rhythm, the same sense of turning inward. Aryan knelt near the largest stone, clearing away a mat of lichen to reveal a set of intersecting lines. Not random, but deliberate. They formed a shape like a crown, but its points were uneven, as though each tip marked a different place. "Look," he said quietly, "this one here, it faces the shore where we left. This one points inland, and this toward the cliff caves." They both leaned closer. The crown's lines seemed to extend beyond the stone itself, as though hinting at a path that was not entirely of this world. A sudden gust swept across the ridge, bending the pines until their needles hissed. The wind carried with it a sound, faint but distinct, of running water. Not the sea, but a stream or river, though there was none this high on the island. They followed the sound down the far side of the ridge, through a stand of twisted oaks whose roots gripped the earth like ancient hands. The air grew cooler, and the smell of damp earth replaced the salt. At last they reached a narrow hollow where a thin stream wound between smooth stones. It was no more than ankle deep, yet its surface reflected the sky with unsettling clarity, as though the water were made of glass. Irene crouched beside it, dipping her hand into the current. It was cold but not unpleasant, a cold that sharpened the mind rather than numbing it. When she drew her hand back, a single droplet clung to her fingertip, catching the light in a way that seemed almost metallic. Aryan followed the stream upstream, his steps slow, deliberate. The water's path led them toward a cleft in the earth, half hidden by ferns. It was not a cave exactly, but an opening that seemed to breathe, cool air drifting out as though the ground itself exhaled. Inside, the walls were lined with pale stone veined in silver grey, and the sound of water was louder, echoing in the narrow space. The stream slipped through a channel carved deep into the floor, its course vanishing into darkness. They stood there a long while, not speaking. The air inside felt thick with intention, as though the place itself had been waiting to be found again. Irene closed her eyes and heard it. Not the sound of water, but a deeper tone beneath it, slow and steady, like a drum played far below the surface. It pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. When she opened her eyes, Irene was watching her. "You hear it too," he said. She nodded. They both understood that whatever the crown was, object, place, or bond, it was tied to this rhythm, and now the path they sought no longer lay only across the sea. It wound beneath their own feet, in the veins of the island itself. The stream whispered onward into the cleft, its glass-like surface breaking only where it met the shadowed stone. Irene and Aryan stood at the threshold for some time, listening to that underground rhythm, the deep, patient heartbeat that seemed older than the island itself. The air inside was neither warm nor cold, but carried a faint mineral scent, like the inside of a seashell. Every sound felt amplified, the soft crunch of their boots on gravel, the quiet shift of clothing, the low sigh of the earth itself. They moved slowly, hands grazing the damp walls for balance, veins of silver and pale blue, threaded through the rock, catching the dim light that filtered from behind them. Now and then the stones gave off a sheen as if lit from within, fading as quickly as it appeared. The stream bent and narrowed, forcing them to step carefully along a raised ledge beside it. The water here was darker, though when Irene glanced down, she thought she saw faint flickers of light beneath the surface, like lanterns swaying in some unseen current. "Do you see it?" she whispered. Aryan paused, peering into the water. "It's moving against the flow." The flickers swirled lazily, as though drawn to the sound of their voices. Then, as if startled, they drifted deeper, vanishing into the stream's blackness. They pressed onward. The tunnel widened into a rounded chamber, its ceiling high enough that their footsteps began to echo. From somewhere unseen above, a slow drip fell into the water, each drop sending ripples across the mirrored surface. In the chamber's center stood a single stone column, rising from the water itself. Its surface was smoother than the surrounding rock, and carved with the same spiral marks they had seen on the ridge. At its top sat something unexpected, a shallow stone basin, filled to the brim with water so still it looked like polished obsidian. Irene reached out but stopped short of touching it. The water's surface reflected her face with unusual clarity. So clear it seemed less a reflection and more a window. But her expression in that mirror was not quite the one she wore. There was a softness in the eyes, a weight in the gaze, as though her reflection knew something she did not. Aryan leaned in beside her, and for a moment both reflections shared the same faint, knowing smile. It was not sinister, only certain. "Do you feel it?" Irene asked. He nodded slowly. It's like being recognized. A soft tremor ran through the ground, subtle yet enough to set tiny ripples dancing across the basin. The reflections blurred, and when they steadied again, both Irene and Aryan felt the air shift as though the chamber had taken note of them. From the far side of the room a new sound emerged, a faint trickle of water where none had been moments before. The stream that had led them here was swelling, its current quickening. The flickers of light beneath the surface returned, swirling in slow arcs, then gathering near the column's base. Without thinking, Irene stepped down into the water. It was colder now, and the lights pulsed gently around her ankles, swirling but never touching.
Blues, greens, and faint golds swirling in slow motion. And then, just as suddenly, all sound hushed. The flickers beneath the water dispersed into the current. The glow of the stone faded to a soft ember, and the air grew still once more. But something had changed. Irene and Aryan felt it, not as a thought, but as a certainty in the chest. The path forward had revealed itself, though they did not yet see it with their eyes. Aryan looked toward the tunnel ahead. The stream continued into the dark, but now its surface was faintly lit, as though it carried the last traces of that glow within it. They exchanged a glance. No words were needed. The way was waiting. Together, they stepped into the narrowing passage, following the silver thread of water deeper into the island's hidden heart.
The tunnel narrowed until the ceiling dipped so low they had to bow their heads. The sound of the stream filled the space, its gentle rush now a constant companion. Every few steps, droplets fell from the stone above, pattering softly against the water's surface. Here, the air grew warmer, carrying the faint scent of something floral, though no flowers could possibly grow in such a place. The fragrance was subtle but persistent, tugging at the edge of memory, like a song half forgotten. Irene slowed her pace, fingertips brushing the wall. Beneath the slick stone, she felt tiny grooves, almost like the weave of fabric. They formed no clear pattern, yet somehow guided her touch, leading her forward. Aryan noticed too. His palm lingered against the opposite wall, tracing the same invisible thread. The tunnel curved sharply, and as they rounded the bend, the light changed. It was no longer the faint glow reflected from the water, but something softer, as though the rock itself exhaled a gentle radiance. The source was impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. The stream widened again, pooling into a shallow basin before continuing onward. The water here was so clear that the bottom looked close enough to touch, though the depth was uncertain. Small pebbles, smoothed by centuries of flow, lay scattered like stars in a dark sky. And then the sound began. Not words, not in the way voices speak, but a rhythm of tone and pause that felt alive. A hum, low and resonant, emerged from the air itself. It wasn't coming from the water or the stone, yet it seemed to belong to both. Irene stood very still, her eyes half closing. She didn't hear the hum so much as she felt it in her bones, like the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't her own. Aryan looked at her, and though neither had spoken, they both knew. The island was not merely a place. It was aware. The hum deepened, and in that sound, images began to form in their minds. Irene saw a sky filled with pale silver clouds, drifting over an endless ocean. In the water below, shapes moved slowly, not fish, but vast beings of light and shadow, gliding in patterns older than time. Aryan's vision was different. He stood on a shore at dusk, the sand cool beneath his feet. Across the horizon, a single immense figure stood in the shallows, its outline blurred as though made of mist. It turned, and though he could not see its face, he felt its gaze settle on him, patient, measuring, unafraid. The visions overlapped for a moment, the ocean merging with the shore, the sky folding into both. Then, as quickly as they had come, they dissolved, leaving only the quiet hum and the sound of water. Irene exhaled slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "It's showing us something." "Or reminding us," Aryan replied. They knelt beside the basin. The water here was warmer than the stream outside, and when they dipped their hands into it, the hum shifted. A higher tone now, almost like a question. Neither knew what answer was expected, but when they let the water slip through their fingers back into the pool, the tone softened again, fading until only silence remained. The silence was not empty. It felt full, like a breath being held. Beyond the basin, the tunnel split into two narrow passages. One was dry, its floor scattered with fine sand. The other carried the stream onward, the current quickening as it disappeared into shadow. Irene looked to Aryan. Which way? He hesitated, then turned his head slightly, listening. There was no hum now, yet he felt a faint pull toward the water path, as though something downstream was waiting. She nodded. They stepped back into the stream, the cool flow swirling around their ankles. The tunnel tightened again, the light dimming, but neither felt the same hesitation as before. Because now they understood. They were not lost.
They were being led, and the island, with its patient, unblinking awareness, was only beginning to speak. The stream quickened, tugging softly at their steps. The walls seemed to lean closer together, their surfaces glistening with moisture that caught the dim light like the sheen of wet shells. Somewhere ahead, the air changed, heavier, warmer, carrying a salt-laced breeze that should not have existed beneath the island's heart. Then came the sound, a slow, measured note, rising and falling, deep enough to vibrate in their ribs. It was not the same hum they had heard before. This was layered, textured, as if more than one voice spoke together, weaving over and under one another until they became a single sound. They followed it without question. The tunnel widened again, and they emerged into a cavern so vast that the ceiling was swallowed in shadow. The stream spilled here into a great underground lake, its surface as still as obsidian. And there, upon that mirror of black water, shimmered light, not from above, but from beneath. The glow pulsed slowly, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. Every rise of light painted the cavern walls in silver and gold. Every fade returned them to deep shadow. Irene stepped to the water's edge, crouching to watch. The light came from far below the lake's surface, shifting like a living thing. Aryan knelt beside her. It feels like, he searched for the word, a memory. They did not speak again, for the moment the word left his lips, the lake began to move. Ripples spread outward from a single point, distorting the reflection of the glowing depths. In those ripples, images formed, faint at first, then clearer, as though the water itself had become a window. They saw an island not as it was now, but as it had been long ago. Its cliffs sheer and jagged, its forests young, its shores unbroken by human step. The sky above it churned with heavy clouds, and the wind sang through the stone in a low, mournful tone. In the water's vision, a figure walked along that empty shore. It was tall, wrapped in a robe of sea silk that shifted between deep green and pale silver. Where its feet touched the sand, tiny streams of water followed, sinking into the earth as though feeding it. The figure knelt, placing a single hand upon the ground. From beneath its palm, light spread, the same light that now pulsed beneath the lake.
Trees rose from the earth in its wake, their leaves shimmering like glass in sunlight. The air filled with the scent of salt and flowers. But as the vision shifted, so too did its tone. A shadow began to form in the distance, not the shape of a storm, but something heavier, darker. It moved toward the island, and as it came, the air stilled, the waves froze mid-crest. Even the wind's voice fell silent. The robed figure turned, its sea silk darkening, and stepped toward the shadow. The light in the trees flickered. The image blurred, and then nothing. The lake went still again, its surface unbroken, the glow retreating far below. Irene's breath came slow, as though she had been holding it for the entire vision. "What was that?" she whispered. Aryan's gaze stayed fixed on the water. "The beginning." The hum returned, softer now, circling them like a tide that never touched their skin. There was no sense of urgency in it, only patience, as though the island knew its story was too vast to be told all at once. Somewhere deep within, both of them understood. They had been shown only a fragment, and there was more yet to come. A path revealed itself at the cavern's far end, a narrow archway carved in stone, its edges smoothed by centuries of flowing water. The air beyond glowed faintly, the same soft silver they had followed since entering the island's heart.
Neither needed to speak. Together, they stepped toward it, the hum following them like a shadow of sound. And as they passed beneath the arch, the island's story began to follow them into the spaces between waking and dreaming. The archway's stone felt warm beneath their fingertips, as though it held the memory of a sun that had not touched it for centuries. Beyond, the passage sloped gently upward. The silver glow thickened in the air, almost tangible now. Not a beam or a shaft, but a soft haze, as if the world ahead had been spun from moonlight. The sound of the hum shifted again. It was quieter, but richer, woven through with distant notes, like bells ringing far away. Each tone seemed to echo in their bones, stirring emotions they could not name. Their footsteps made no sound here. The stone beneath them was smooth, yet not slick, worn by time, by countless steps, perhaps by generations that had come before them seeking this same path. The further they walked,
the more they felt it. A gentle pull, not from ahead or behind, but from within. Irene's thoughts slowed. Images drifted into her mind, not from memory, but from some deeper place. She saw the island's cliffs crowned in gold at sunset. She saw the robed figure once more. Only now its face was turned toward her. It smiled without lips moving, without eyes blinking, as though the act of being seen was its only form of greeting. Aryan, too, felt something, a pressure behind his eyes, a tingling in his palms. It was as if the air was heavier here, filled not with weight, but with presence.
Then they reached it, the Chamber of Currents. The passage opened into a circular hall, carved entirely from white stone that gleamed faintly in the silver light. The walls were etched with flowing patterns, curling like waves, some spiraling inward, others outward, as though charting a map of tides unseen by the human eye. At the center lay a pool, smaller than the lake, yet far more alive. Water streamed into it from several narrow channels, each one a different shade of pale blue or green. They didn't mingle. Instead, they wove around each other like ribbons, creating shifting patterns on the surface. Every so often, one ribbon of water would pulse, sending a ripple across the pool and along the walls, causing the carvings to shimmer faintly, as if acknowledging the movement. Irene approached the pool. She felt a strange urge to reach into it, to touch the ribbons of water and feel their temperature. But as her hand neared the surface, the ribbons slowed, as though waiting. Aryan stood beside her, staring at the carvings. They're not decoration. They're telling something. Indeed, as they looked closer, the patterns resolved into scenes, not of people or creatures, but of moments. A river feeding into the sea, the moon drawing the tide, storm clouds scattering at sunrise. And then, at the farthest point in the chamber, a single carving stood apart. It showed a hand, palm down, pressed into the earth, the same gesture the robed figure had made in the vision by the lake. But here, beneath the hand, the waves were not calm. They were turbulent, crashing upward as though resisting. Irene traced the outline with her fingers. The stone was cool, but her skin tingled where it touched. The hum deepened. The water's ribbons quickened. Without warning, the silver glow around them intensified. The patterns on the walls seemed to turn, as if they were no longer etched, but flowing. The air in the chamber grew warm and damp, heavy with the scent of rain on dry ground. The pool began to shift. The ribbons of water merged, twisting into a single spiral that reached upward like a column of glass. Within that spiral, light flickered, shapes forming and dissolving too quickly to hold, as though 100 scenes were being shown in the space of a breath. Then it slowed, and one image remained. They saw the island again, but closer now. The robed figure stood at its highest point, where stone met the open sky. Around it the sea churned, not in anger, but in anticipation. The figure raised both hands. Light spilled from them into the sky, cascading like rain in reverse. The clouds parted, revealing a moon larger than it should have been, its surface marked with strange shifting patterns. The sea answered, rising in vast glassy waves, not to destroy, but to wrap the island, as though embracing it. And then the vision ended. The spiral collapsed back into the pool, and the ribbons of water separated once more, flowing in their slow, deliberate paths. Silence returned.
Neither Irene nor Aryan spoke for a long while. It was not fear that kept them quiet, but reverence, as though speaking might fracture the delicate thread connecting them to what they had just witnessed. Finally, Aryan murmured, "It's protecting something." Irene nodded, her eyes still fixed on the pool. Or someone. From somewhere deep in the chamber, the hum shifted once more, a note that sounded almost like a sigh. The path onward revealed itself again, a narrow corridor behind the pool, faintly aglow. They stepped toward it, each carrying the weight of what they had seen. The island's heart was not just a place of beauty, it was a keeper of something ancient, something alive. And as they passed out of the chamber, the glow followed them, not from the walls or the floor, but from within their own steps. The corridor behind the pool narrowed to a single winding passage, the walls curving like the inside of a seashell. The silver glow that had clung to them since the chamber no longer came from the stone, it came from them. Their footsteps revealed it, each step leaving a faint shimmer on the ground that faded after a few heartbeats. It was not a path made for haste. The air here was heavier, warmer, as if the island itself had drawn closer to listen. Every breath felt as though it carried meaning. At one bend they paused. The sound of water was gone. The hum, too, had softened to the faintest vibration, like the lingering echo of a bell long after it had been struck. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a low-arched chamber. The walls here were not carved. They were alive. Coral, petrified in mid-growth, still holding the shapes of branching arms, hollow tubes, and delicate fans. Light pooled across their surfaces, caught in the patterns like starlight in a frozen sky. In the center of the chamber stood something unlike anything they had yet seen, a stone pedestal, no higher than their knees, upon which rested a disk of translucent material. It was not glass, nor crystal. Its surface shimmered with slow-moving shapes, like clouds drifting underwater. Aryan crouched, leaning closer. "It's moving," he whispered. The disk shifted, revealing not reflections, but scenes. First, the shoreline, waves sliding in, then out, their edges rimmed with silver foam. Then the cliffs at dusk, then the deep forest, lit not by the sun, but by something beneath the ground. The images did not replace one another, they layered, until the disk held dozens of places at once, as though the island's entire body had been folded into it. Irene reached out, not to touch the disk, but to hover her palm above it. The glow between her skin and the surface flared, and suddenly she was no longer seeing the chamber. She stood on the cliffs, wind in her hair, moonlight on the water. But when she looked down, the ocean was not black or blue. It was full of light, threads of it, weaving in currents that spiraled toward the island's heart. The robed figure was there, not far from her, its hands raised to the sky. It did not speak, yet in its stillness Irene felt the question, "Will you step further?" Her answer was not in words. She turned her palm downward. In the chamber, Aryan saw her lower her hand to the disk. The instant her skin made contact, the air shifted. The coral walls brightened. The faint hum returned, but now it was not distant. It was inside their chests. The disk rippled under her touch. Then the ripple spread outward, as though the pedestal itself were a still pond, disturbed by a single drop. The coral began to sing. It was not music, not exactly. The sound was the rush of tides through reefs, the distant booming of waves in a cavern, the soft hiss of foam breaking on the shore. Yet within it were tones, low, patient, and ancient, a voice not made of language, but of place. The images within the disk shifted. Now they saw not only the island, but beyond it, waters stretching into the horizon, broken by moving shapes. Some were fish, darting silver in the currents. Others were massive, their forms only hinted at in shadow, passing with slow, deliberate grace. The voice within the coral deepened. It was not threatening, yet its weight was undeniable. Irene lifted her hand. The light dimmed. The hum faded to a murmur. The images dissolved, leaving the disk clouded once more. Neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, Aryan said, "We weren't meant to take it, only to hear it." She nodded, "And now it knows we're here."
There was no further door, no obvious way onward, yet the ground seemed to guide them, the faint shimmer under their feet brightening in one direction. They followed it. The coral gave way to smooth stone again. The air grew cooler, and then, after a final bend, they stepped into a space so open it seemed impossible underground. It was a cavern, vast, with a ceiling lost in darkness. The floor sloped gently toward a pool so black it seemed like a hole in the world. From its surface rose faint strands of light, curling upward like smoke before fading into the shadows above. They stood at its edge. The water was utterly still. Aryan knelt, peering into it. It's not a reflection, it's depth, like it doesn't end. Irene said nothing. She could feel it now, clearer than before, the heartbeat they had heard in the passage earlier, but here it was steady, strong, and impossibly deep. The glow from their steps pooled around them, reflecting faintly on the water's surface before sinking into it, as if drawn downward. The hum returned one last time, steady and low, curling around them like a final invitation. They knew, without words, that crossing this pool, in whatever way the island intended, was the threshold. Beyond it lay what the island truly guarded. They exchanged a glance, and then, together, they stepped forward. The first step into the pool was not like stepping into water. There was no splash, no resistance. It was as if the surface had been nothing but a veil, and beyond it was something weightless, endless, a space without up or down, without temperature or current. The blackness closed over them, and yet they could see, not with their eyes, but with something quieter, deeper. Shapes moved in the distance, not fish, not human, but threads of light, gliding slowly as though they had been drifting for centuries. The sensation was not of sinking, but of being drawn, not by force, but by recognition, as though the pool had been expecting them. They did not speak. The act of thought itself seemed to ripple outward, visible in the faint gleam around their bodies. The heartbeat they had heard above was here too, louder, steadier. Not a sound, but a rhythm within the very space around them. It was neither threatening nor welcoming. It was simply there, the constant truth of this place.
The deeper they went, the more the darkness began to change. It shifted into blues so deep they bordered on black, then into slow spirals of pale green light, each curling like a fern unfurling in slow motion.
In the distance, a shape appeared, vast and curved, its surface glimmering with faint patterns. As they drew closer, the patterns sharpened. They were carvings, though no hand had made them. Lines and symbols flowed across the surface in shifting constellations, forming and reforming like the changing tide. Aryan slowed. "It's alive," he whispered, though he could not have said why he knew it. The shape was not stone. It pulsed faintly, as if breathing. It was the shell of something immense, something coiled within itself. As they hovered before it, one section of the shell slowly opened, not with the creak of hinges or the grind of stone, but like the unfurling of a flower at dawn. Beyond it was light, not blinding, but infinite. They stepped through. The sensation was instant. The pressure of the deep was gone, replaced by a warmth that was not of air or sun, but of memory. They stood on solid ground again. It was unlike any place they had seen. The land was both lush and barren, wide stretches of pale sand that shone like bone, broken by groves of trees whose leaves shimmered between gold and silver as they swayed. The sky above was not blue. It was a slow-moving tapestry of clouds lit from within, their light shifting from white to amber to deep violet. The air carried the scent of salt and something older, a sweetness that hinted at flowers they had never seen blooming somewhere beyond sight. They began to walk, though they did not know toward what. The ground beneath their feet shifted subtly with each step, not in instability, but in nature, sometimes soft as moss, sometimes smooth as polished stone. It was as if the land adjusted to their presence, reshaping itself to the pace of their journey. In the distance, they saw movement. Figures, tall, robed in garments that shimmered like water. Their faces were hidden, their steps slow and deliberate. The figures moved in a wide circle around a central point, a low mound of earth from which grew a single tree. The tree's bark was pale as driftwood, and its branches stretched high, tipped with leaves that caught the shifting sky like fragments of glass. At the base of the tree lay a pool, small, perfectly still, reflecting not the sky above, but something deeper.
The robed figures did not acknowledge Aryan and Irene directly, but as the two approached, the circle widened, making space for them. The hum that had followed them through the island was here too, softer now, almost like a song being sung in a language they could not understand, but could feel in their bones. They stopped at the edge of the pool. Its surface was unlike the black water they had crossed before. Here it was clear, so clear that it seemed not to exist at all, a window into a depthless expanse. Within it, faint shapes moved. They were moments, the way a child's hand had once reached for a shell on the beach, the path of a storm across a dark sea, the slow drift of a single feather on the wind. Each image lasted only as long as it took to notice it, then it was replaced by another. The tree above them shifted. The leaves made no sound, but with each movement the pool's images changed, as though the two were bound, one feeding the other. Irene reached forward, stopping just shy of touching the water.
She could feel the coolness radiating from it, the way a deep well breathes chill air on a summer day. Something in her told her that touching the pool would not simply show her more, it would show her memories, her moments, not as she remembered them, but as they truly were. She hesitated. Aryan's gaze was fixed on the robed figures. He could feel their attention now, not in their eyes, for their faces were hidden, but in the quiet steadiness of their stance. They were waiting. For what, neither could say. The hum deepened, filling the air, the ground, their chests, and somewhere, beneath it all, that steady heartbeat continued, patient, ancient, unchanging. The stairway's descent ended at a vast circular hall, the air thick with the scent of water and stone polished by centuries. Pillars carved with spirals and flowing lines supported the high ceiling, each one etched with a pattern that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. In the center lay another pool, smaller than the lake above, yet far more luminous. Its waters shone with an inner radiance that bathed the hall in silver-blue light. The surface was utterly still, as though no breath of air dared disturb it. Aryan and Irene stepped closer. At first, they expected to see their own reflections. Instead, the pool showed a scene entirely separate from their presence. It was the island again, but not as they had seen in the lake's earlier vision. This was not its birth, nor its untouched days. Here, the island was alive with voices and movement. Figures in long, flowing garments walked among curved buildings carved into the cliffs. Their skin bore the faint shimmer of pearl, and their hair moved as though caught in a perpetual tide, even in still air. The two travelers could hear them, not through the air, but as if their voices spoke inside the mind. Words in a language neither Irene nor Aryan knew, yet whose meaning settled softly into their thoughts. They spoke of tides and wind, of the turning of the moon, of harvests gathered from both forest and sea. There was a peace in their way of life, but also a carefulness, as though every action was weighed for its effect upon the island's balance.
In the vision, a younger figure ran toward the shore. This one wore no elaborate robe, only simple linen, and their laughter was unshadowed by caution. They dove into the water, vanishing beneath the waves for long moments before rising again, holding something small and glowing between their hands. The moment their feet touched land, the air around them shimmered. The glow in their hands spread outward in thin silver threads, running along the sand and vanishing into the forest. Irene's breath caught. "They're feeding it." Aryan nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the scene. "The island isn't just land, it's alive." The vision deepened. They saw the young figure grow, their hair darkening, their eyes shadowed. They now wore a robe of sea silk and walked beside the elder who had first shaped the island in the vision by the lake. Together they stood at the shore, facing the horizon where the dark shadow from the first vision was slowly returning. The elder placed a hand upon the younger's shoulder. No words were heard, yet a feeling passed, one of weight, of duty handed down like an anchor from one tide to the next. The younger lowered their head, accepting. Then the water in the vision turned black. A wind swept across the scene, erasing the shimmer from the trees, bending their trunks, tearing leaves into the sea. The people vanished from sight. The curved buildings cracked. The glow of the island dimmed until it was nothing but a faint pulse beneath the earth. The pool's surface rippled once, then cleared, returning to its still, luminous state. Irene stepped back, heart slow but heavy. It was them, the young one. They were meant to hold the balance. Aryan's gaze did not leave the water. And they failed, or his voice trailed off, or they chose another way. Silence stretched in the hall, deep and steady, as though the stone itself was thinking. Then from the far wall came the faintest shimmer of movement. It was not a door, not exactly, but an opening that had not been visible until the vision ended. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor, lined with faint, silver light. The hum returned, no longer distant. This time it felt as though it was inside their own bones. Without speaking, they moved toward the opening, their steps echoing softly in the circular hall. The pool's glow dimmed behind them, but they felt it at their backs, a steady heartbeat in the depths. As they entered the passage, Irene glanced at Aryan. "We're not just seeing their past anymore." He nodded once. "No, we're walking into it." The corridor curved downward, the light ahead growing stronger, warmer, almost like dawn breaking beneath the earth. And though neither would say it aloud, both carried the same quiet thought. If the shadow was returning, then so was the one meant to face it. The corridor tightened as they moved forward, its smooth stone walls giving way to surfaces marked with flowing lines that glimmered faintly like threads of moonlight caught in the rock. The air was warmer here, carrying a scent unlike any above, not salt, not earth, but something almost metallic, like rain striking bronze. Their footsteps no longer echoed, but seemed absorbed into the living silence, as if the passageway itself was listening. With every step, the hum they had first felt distantly grew stronger, no longer just a sound, but a sensation in the chest, in the fingertips, in the spaces between thoughts. Irene could feel her heartbeat matching it, and when she glanced at Aryan, she saw his breathing slow to the same unhurried rhythm. The curve of the corridor bent them ever downward, until the silver light ahead no longer seemed like a glow cast from a torch or a lantern, but rather the very air ahead, brightening of its own accord. They emerged into a chamber vast enough to hold a cathedral, its ceiling lost in darkness above, its floor an intricate mosaic of stone and shell arranged in whorls and spirals that radiated from a single point at the center. At that center stood something that was not entirely stone nor entirely living, a towering form like a tree carved from pale crystal, its roots embedded deep into the ground, its trunk smooth and translucent, filled with a slow-moving shimmer that rose and fell in steady pulses.
Then they turned back toward the island, bringing with them no treasure, no proof, only a deeper certainty that their journey had truly begun. The villagers would not see the difference in their eyes, but the sea would. And that was enough. The return to the island was quiet, not in the sense that no one noticed, but rather no one asked. In places where old customs still breathed, silence was its own form of acknowledgement. Irene and Aryan walked the familiar sand in the early morning light. The tide was far out, exposing dark ribbons of seaweed and pools where small crabs moved in slow, deliberate arcs. The air had the sharpness of salt and stone. They had no plans that day, yet both felt a pull toward the higher ground at the island's heart. A ridge crowned with wind-bent pines and scattered standing stones, worn almost to smoothness by time. It was a place neither had visited since childhood, when games and dares had led them scrambling up its slopes. Now, it felt different. The path was narrow and uneven, winding between thickets of seagrass and wild heather. The wind here spoke in different tones, less the restless voice of the shore, more the slow, deep murmur of something that had been watching for centuries. As they climbed, the air seemed to thin, not from height, but from age. The scent of the pines mingled with something older, a faint mineral tang, like the memory of rain on stone long after the clouds had gone. At the top, they found the stones as they remembered them, though now they seemed to stand closer together, their lean shapes catching the light like sentinels. Moss clung thick to their bases, and faint carvings, almost lost to erosion, curved along their surfaces. Irene ran her fingers over one of them, tracing a shallow spiral. It reminded her of the water's curl from the night before. The shape was not identical, but it held the same rhythm, the same sense of turning inward. Aryan knelt near the largest stone, clearing away a mat of lichen to reveal a set of intersecting lines. Not random, but deliberate. They formed a shape like a crown, but its points were uneven, as though each tip marked a different place. "Look," he said quietly. "This one here. It faces the shore where we left. This one points inland, and this, toward the cliff caves." They both leaned closer. The crown's lines seemed to extend beyond the stone itself, as though hinting at a path that was not entirely of this world. A sudden gust swept across the ridge, bending the pines until their needles hissed. The wind carried with it a sound, faint but distinct, of running water. Not the sea, but a stream or river, though there was none this high on the island. They followed the sound down the far side of the ridge, through a stand of twisted oaks whose roots gripped the earth like ancient hands. The air grew cooler, and the smell of damp earth replaced the salt. At last, they reached a narrow hollow where a thin stream wound between smooth stones. It was no more than ankle deep, yet its surface reflected the sky with unsettling clarity, as though the water were made of glass. Irene crouched beside it, dipping her hand into the current. It was cold, but not unpleasant, a cold that sharpened the mind rather than numbing it. When she drew her hand back, a single droplet clung to her fingertip, catching the light in a way that seemed almost metallic. Aryan followed the stream upstream, his steps slow, deliberate. The water's path led them toward a cleft in the earth, half hidden by ferns. It was not a cave exactly, but an opening that seemed to breathe, cool air drifting out, as though the ground itself exhaled. Inside, the walls were lined with pale stone veined in silver gray, and the sound of water was louder, echoing in the narrow space. The stream slipped through a channel carved deep into the floor, its course vanishing into darkness. They stood there a long while, not speaking. The air inside felt thick with intention, as though the place itself had been waiting to be found again. Irene closed her eyes and heard it, not the sound of water, but a deeper tone beneath it, slow and steady, like a drum played far below the surface. It pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. When she opened her eyes, Aryan was watching her. "You hear it too," he said. She nodded. They both understood that whatever the crown was, object, place, or bond, it was tied to this rhythm. And now, the path they sought no longer lay only across the sea. It wound beneath their own feet, in the veins of the island itself. When one turned its gaze toward Irene, she felt no fear, only the strange, weightless calm of being seen without being judged, as though it had known her since before she was born. Aryan walked beside her in silence, his expression softened, his eyes reflecting the mirrored light of their surroundings, and she realized that here, words felt unnecessary. The place spoke in sensations, in currents of thought that moved without sound. Ahead, the starlit path dipped downward toward a wide basin, its edges rimmed with silver haze, and within it flowed a vast, slow whirlpool of light. It turned not with the speed of water caught in a drain, but with the patience of seasons, each spiral carrying within it faint images, fragments of forests, storms, faces, and ruins, all gliding past in endless repetition. As they reached its edge, a low vibration rose from beneath their feet, resonating through the air and into their chests, until it became a rhythm not unlike the heartbeat of the crystal tree they had left behind. One of the great shapes approached the basin, its immense form casting a shadow that was not dark, but instead filled with deep color, like the inside of a shell. It lowered its head until it almost touched the spiraling light, and then, with a sound like distant thunder stretched into eternity, it released a single droplet from its luminous body. The droplet fell into the whirlpool and rippled outward, and where the ripples spread, the images changed. Irene and Aryan saw not just visions now, but movements that felt closer, more urgent, ships struggling in a storm beneath a blackened sky, fires burning along a shoreline, and in the waves between them, a presence like the shadow from before, vast and shapeless, blotting out the horizon. The sense of calm in the air remained, but underneath it now was an undeniable undercurrent of warning. Irene stepped forward, compelled, and the surface of the whirlpool brightened beneath her gaze. She saw herself again holding the shard of crystal, but this time the vision expanded. Aryan was there too, carrying another shard, the two of them placing them together at the base of the great crystalline tree. The light that erupted from it surged outward, not just along the roots, but deep into the ocean, threading through channels of stone and coral, reaching places unseen. A thought came to her then, unbidden but clear. These shards were not simply tools, but living parts of the island itself, separated long ago when the shadow had first come. It's not just about finding it, Irene murmured without realizing she was speaking. It's about bringing it back. Whole. Aryan nodded, though his gaze remained on the great shape before them, as if listening to something only he could hear. The shape turned away from the basin and began to drift along a new path of light that curved away into the distance, leaving behind a faint trail in its wake. A trail that shimmered faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the crystal tree's heartbeat. Without a word, Irene and Aryan stepped onto it, and the moment their feet touched its surface, they felt themselves drawn forward once more. This time the movement was swifter, though still without wind or the sense of steps being taken, as if the path itself was carrying them. The stars below deepened in color, shifting from silver to a deep, glassy blue, and the darkness above them began to thin, revealing towering silhouettes in the distance. These were not arches or walls, but colossal standing forms, shaped like monoliths, yet carved with patterns so intricate they seemed alive. As they drew nearer, Irene saw that the patterns moved, not random swirls, but maps, flowing with shifting currents, showing rivers that bent like serpents, mountains that breathed clouds, and oceans that turned into skies. It struck her then that perhaps they were not looking at maps of land at all, but maps of time itself. One of the monoliths leaned subtly toward them, its upper edge bending in a way no stone should, and from the patterns upon it a single thread of light extended downward, touching the path just ahead. The moment they stepped over it, Irene felt a jolt, not of pain, but of memory. She was once again on the cliffs in her vision, but now the air was thick with heat, the sea below boiling under a black sky. Behind her, the tree pulsed violently, and she understood in that instant that the island had not simply chosen them. It had waited for them. Aryan's hand closed gently around her wrist, grounding her, and the vision faded back to the starlit expanse. "We have to follow it," he said, his voice quiet but certain. And so they continued, the path unwinding before them toward whatever lay at the farthest edge of this place. A place that felt both infinite and inevitable, as though they were walking not into the unknown, but into a story already written long before they had ever stepped onto the island. The path ahead narrowed, its shimmering edge blending almost seamlessly into the darkness, until it felt as though they were walking on nothing at all, with only the faint pulse of light beneath their feet to remind them that something held them above the void. The towering monoliths they had passed receded behind them, their shifting maps dimming until they were little more than shadowed outlines, as if deliberately retreating from what lay ahead. The air, though not air in any earthly sense, seemed to grow denser, and the gentle hum that had carried them so far faded into a deeper, slower vibration, one that resonated through their bones like the echo of a distant drumbeat. Irene became aware of a change in the light. The stars beneath their feet were fewer now, and those that remained glowed with a faint amber tone instead of silver, their flicker irregular, as though tired or wounded. Aryan noticed it too, his gaze dropping briefly before he looked ahead with renewed focus. And there, at the very edge of sight, something moved. Not the graceful drifting of the great shapes they had seen before, but a ripple that swallowed light rather than reflected it, bending the space around it into curves that made the horizon shiver. It wasn't until it began to draw closer that Irene understood why it was so hard to see. It was not one thing, but many, overlapping like sheets of smoke, caught in a slow spiral. Each fold seemed to reveal a fleeting form, a wave breaking in reverse, a mountain sinking into the ground, a face half-formed and then gone, all of it shifting so fluidly it could never be fully grasped. The vibration in the air deepened, and with it came a faint whispering, not in words, but in sensations. Cold pressure at the back of the skull, a taste of iron on the tongue, the distant echo of waves striking rock. It was the same presence Irene had felt in her earlier vision, but here it was stronger, heavier, as if its attention had truly fixed upon them. Aryan's steps slowed, and for a moment Irene thought he might stop altogether. But then the path beneath their feet flared slightly, a reminder from the island, or from whatever force guided them, that they could not turn back. The shadowed spiral shifted again, and a piece of it detached, gliding toward them in a motion so smooth it was almost beautiful. As it approached, the light beneath them dimmed, and for the first time, Irene felt the temperature change, a slow, creeping chill that seeped into her limbs despite the absence of wind. The form stopped a short distance away, hovering just above the path, and for a moment it hung there in silence, its surface rippling. Then, in its depths, light appeared, not bright, but the dull glow of embers beneath ash, and with it came images. They were not visions like before, not shaped for clarity, but flashes, jagged and fractured. Water churning in darkness, a tree falling in slow motion, shards of crystal sinking into black sand. Between these flashes came others, far older, she sensed, moments of storms swallowing entire coastlines, cities dissolving under waves, light extinguished in places she could not name. And threaded through all of it was a hunger that did not feel alive in the way they knew life, but instead ancient, mechanical, inevitable, like the turning of a tide that had always been and would always return. "It's not just destruction," Aryan said softly, as if piecing it together aloud. "It's A cycle. The form pulsed faintly, and Irene had the unsettling impression that it had heard and understood him. Her own thoughts echoed with the memory of the crystal shard, its warmth in her palm, the way the light had surged outward when the visions had shown it whole again. If this shadow, this tide, came in cycles, then the shards were perhaps the only anchor against it, the only way to root the island and its strange realms so they would not be carried away into that endless spiral. The form lingered for another moment, and then, without warning, it dissolved, flowing back into the larger shadow as if drawn by some silent command. The path brightened slightly, as though relieved of a weight, and ahead the darkness thinned just enough to reveal what lay beyond. A vast, still sea that stretched out in all directions, its surface perfectly smooth and reflective, mirroring the skyless expanse above. At its center stood something tall and impossibly slender, a pillar of crystal, much like the tree in shape but stripped of branches, rising directly from the water. Even from this distance, Irene could feel its presence, not alive in the way the tree was, but watchful, as if it bore silent witness to everything that passed. Around its base the water was darker, and in that darkness, the shadow spiral turned, patient and slow. The realization settled on her then, with quiet certainty. The pillar was a marker, a place where the cycle began and ended, and if they were to stop it, they would have to stand there, at its very heart. Aryan met her gaze, no words needed, and together they stepped forward, the path extending across the still sea, carrying them toward the place where light and shadow waited to decide what would remain and what would be taken. The path stretched before them like a fragile ribbon across the mirrored sea, each step carrying a faint tremor that whispered of the distance between the world they knew and the heart of the island's secret. The crystal pillar loomed closer, taller than anything they had encountered, its surface smooth yet impossibly intricate. Faint veins of glowing amber tracing patterns that seemed to shift as they watched. It was neither cold nor warm, but carried a presence, patient, watchful, ancient, and the air around it vibrated with a low hum that harmonized with the pulse in their own chests. Irene could feel it in her bones, in the subtle quickening of her heartbeat, as though the island itself had paused to study them. The shadow spiral circled the pillar's base, slower now, deliberate, almost contemplative, as if it too awaited the next step. She glanced at Aryan, and he nodded, their silent agreement bridging the uncertainty between them. Together, they stepped onto the water's reflective surface, their movement gentle, careful, as if even a sudden gesture could shatter the balance. With each step, the reflections rippled softly, bending light and shadow into shapes that danced just beyond comprehension. Shapes of creatures they could not name, of landscapes that seemed both familiar and impossibly distant, of moments of quiet and storm entwined. The closer they drew to the pillar, the stronger the resonance in the air became, and it was as if the vibrations carried memory, centuries of tides and tempests folded into one steady thrum. When they reached the base, the shadow spiral paused entirely, like a breath held, and the water stilled, forming a perfect mirror around the pillar's foundation. Irene reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the crystalline surface, and warmth surged upward, gentle yet insistent, a pulse that matched her own heartbeat. Within the pillar, light began to shift, not in color but in rhythm, as though it were breathing with them, listening to the quiet intentions in their minds. And then the images came, clearer than before, not fleeting fragments but flowing sequences, forests untouched by shadow, rivers running unbroken into the horizon, small settlements glowing softly beneath twilight skies. Each scene held a sense of calm persistence, the quiet endurance of life against cycles they had only glimpsed before. The spiral of shadow trembled, and Irene sensed a weight in its movement, a question hanging in the space between them. Would they preserve what had been, anchor the light against the tide, or step aside and allow the cycle to sweep everything into the deep unknown? Aryan's voice was a soft murmur, almost swallowed by the hum of the pillar. "It doesn't ask for destruction," he said. "It waits. It measures what we bring, how we respond." Irene closed her eyes and let herself feel the pulse beneath her palm, the subtle warmth of the pillar, the mirrored water beneath her feet. In that quiet, she understood that the choice was not about power, not about heroism, but about patience, clarity, and intention. The shadow spiral began to fold inward slightly, curling like smoke toward the center, and with it came a sensation that both unsettled and reassured her. The tide was neither cruel nor benevolent, only inevitable, and yet it could be held, guided, with enough care. She and Aryan exchanged a look, an understanding that needed no words, and together they pressed their hands to the pillar, side by side, letting the energy course through them, letting it harmonize with the rhythm of the island itself. Light surged gently within the crystal, spreading outward, not violently, but like dawn pushing against night. The spiral of shadow at the base shimmered, then slowed, folding in on itself until it became a soft ripple that merged with the mirrored surface, leaving only a faint shimmer of movement behind. The island seemed to sigh, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the ground beneath the water and through their very bones. A quiet calm settled, and for the first time since they had arrived, the horizon seemed infinite yet safe, balanced in a harmony that suggested the tide had accepted their presence and intention. Irene withdrew her hand, and the warmth lingered in her palm, faint but steady, as though the island had left a quiet echo of itself with her. Aryan did the same, and together they stepped back, the path beneath their feet now glowing with a soft silver light, guiding them gently away from the pillar. The mirrored sea reflected not just the skyless expanse above, but the sense of balance, the subtle equilibrium of shadow and light held in fragile perfection. They walked slowly, almost reluctantly, leaving the central pillar behind, carrying with them the understanding that their actions had anchored something larger than themselves, something timeless. Around them, the air was still, yet alive with quiet vibrations, whispering memories of storms averted, cycles tempered, and moments of patient endurance. And as they continued along the shimmering path, the first hints of dawn, not light in the traditional sense, but a gentle glow spreading across the reflective water, began to appear, promising that the island, for all its mystery and shadow, had been given another chance to exist in its own rhythm. Each step away from the pillar felt lighter, yet purposeful, as though the act of leaving was itself a part of the preservation. Irene glanced at Aryan, and they shared a faint, knowing smile, understanding that this journey had changed them in ways words could not capture. The spiral of shadow remained, distant and serene, no longer a threat, but a presence folded into the harmony of the island. And in the quiet, there was a promise that balance could endure, even in the presence of inevitable cycles, if met with clarity, care, and intent. As they walked, the gentle vibration of the island beneath their feet lulled them, the mirrored water reflecting their calm, the soft hum of the pillar still lingering faintly in the air. a memory of the choice they had made, a reminder that the myth of Irene and Aryan was now woven into the very essence of the island, quiet yet eternal, ready to carry the story onward in gentle resonance for those who might one day awaken to its whispers. The way back felt different, not because the distance had shortened, but because the world around them seemed newly tuned to the pace of their footsteps. The stones beneath their soles hummed faintly, as if in recognition, and the air itself carried a softness that had not been there when they first came, a kind of gentle forgiveness that smoothed the edges of everything it touched. As they left the mirrored sea and the pillar's steady pulse behind, the path unrolled beneath them like a ribbon of light, guiding rather than demanding. And with each measured step, they felt the island breathe in a fuller, calmer way. Reeds along the shore no longer tossed in anxious rhythm, but bent like bowed heads in relief. And where once the dark spiral had knotted the horizon, now it lay folded. A distant tide line lowered and tamed. The vast shapes that had drifted in the deep slowed their passage to a languid drift, circling as if to watch and learn rather than to judge. And one of them lingered near the shore, lowering a slow, shimmering crest that scattered soft motes of light across the water like seeds of dawn. Irene and Aryan walked without speaking at first, letting the quiet do its work. It settled into them, eased the tightness in their limbs, and warmed that particular kind of ache that comes from having faced something larger than yourself and lived through it. When they passed back into the corridors beneath the hill, the carved spirals upon the walls seemed to glow with a memory of their hands, as if the stone itself kept score of journeys made with true intention. The pools they had touched earlier now reflected them not as strangers to a myth, but as part of it. Two small figures whose shadows fit into the wider pattern of leaves, tide lines, and starlit maps. Villagers would later tell tales of how the lamps in the harbor burned a little brighter the night they returned. But Irene and Aryan noticed only small human signs first. A child's laugh behind a shuttered window, an old dog lifting its head to listen, a kettle's whistle in the distance, ordinary sounds that tasted like home after the deep, patient music of the island's inner places. They took their time descending the familiar ridge, and where the land had once felt secretive and closed, now it unfurled kindness. The scrubby pines bent low as if in salute, and the standing stones along the path seemed less like silent sentinels and more like old friends nodding at their safe passage. When they crested the final rise and looked down upon Elathos, the village lay unchanged in form but altered in feel. Smoke rose in steadier columns from the ovens. Women moved with softer steps in the lanes, and the small harbor held boats tied in neat rows, their ropes slack with the contentment of a place not expecting sudden storms. They did not hurry to explain what had happened. Legends grow clumsy when forced into speech too soon. Instead, they walked among the market stalls, letting light and ordinary touch reacquaint them with the human scale of life. Mornings arrived wrapped in a soft, silvery mist that clung to the cove and made every familiar shape appear slightly new, as though the world itself were reminding them that discovery need not always come from distant places. Irene would walk barefoot along the wet sand, letting the foam curl around her ankles, while Aryan, carrying a small satchel of herbs and seeds, would follow the trail of gulls skimming over the tide, listening to the low murmur of waves, counting each exhale as though the rhythm were a secret only they could hear. The village, too, seemed to change with their subtle attention. Ovens glowed a little steadier. The blacksmith's hammer rang with a clearer tone, and even the smallest of gestures, a basket left for a neighbor, a lantern lit earlier than usual, spread warmth across the narrow lanes and winding alleys. Children, once shy of the deeper forests and rocky ridges, began to follow Irene and Aryan on quiet explorations, their laughter floating like tiny bells across the morning air. They did not rush. They merely observed, picking up feathers, pressing smooth stones into pockets, and pausing to watch a heron lift from the reeds. And in these small acts, the lessons of the island unfolded more gently than any words could ever convey. Patience, care, and the understanding that the unseen currents, the ones that guide tides and hearts alike, are often stronger than the force of a single hand. In the afternoons, when the sun leaned low, casting long amber shadows across the hills, Irene and Aryan would tend to the ridge's small garden where the sapling had begun to root. Each plant they touched responded in quiet gratitude. Leaves turned slightly toward their hands, buds opened with a timidity that promised resilience, and the earth itself seemed to settle more comfortably around the roots. Passers-by might see nothing more than two figures working in a patch of soil, but the air around them carried a subtle weightlessness, a sense of calm that lingered long after they had moved on. Evenings held their own rituals, slower still, where firelight caught on faces and walls, casting soft, undulating patterns that mirrored the waves beyond. It was in this gentle darkness that the island revealed its smallest wonders: bioluminescent algae that traced quiet arcs along the tide, a fox moving with fluid grace between the shadows, the low hum of insects that wove a delicate chorus beneath the stars. Irene and Aryan would sit by the water, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply breathing together, feeling a connection not only to each other, but to the endless flow of stories that the island carried beneath its stones and reeds. And the stories were not only their own. In the gentle quiet of night, they could sense the echo of voices long past, the whisper of travelers and keepers, of sailors and elders who had once traced similar paths, leaving behind subtle traces of hope and caution, of courage and curiosity. It was a music without melody, yet it resonated with a profound clarity, offering both reassurance and invitation to those willing to listen. Days became weeks, and the villagers' trust in the rhythm of this renewed space deepened. Merchants left baskets of fruit and bread near the ridge for Irene and Aryan, not as gifts, but as small acknowledgments of the care they had brought to the island. Fishermen began leaving their boats untied for longer stretches, confident that the tide and the unseen currents would guide them safely home. And in these gestures, subtle yet significant, the villagers understood a truth they had long sensed, but never spoken aloud. The island was alive in ways that surpassed their daily understanding, and those who honored it, quietly, consistently, were themselves part of its enduring heartbeat. In the quieter moments, Irene would trace her fingers along the carved stones in the chapel, noting the tiny imperfections and deliberate patterns that had once seemed merely ornamental. Each spiral and line now seemed to hold meaning, a careful record of generations who had walked these lands with care and reverence. Aryan would gather driftwood and smooth it along the edges, turning each piece into a small token of respect, placing them near the altar or along the ridge where light would catch them just so. Nights would come and go like gentle waves, each leaving behind traces of a dreamlike calm that settled into bones and breath alike. Lanterns floated silently in the coves and along the river's bend, not as markers for passage but as symbols of quiet persistence. Reminders that even small acts, when sustained, carry a weight far beyond immediate perception. And through it all, Irene and Aryan learned the subtle art of listening, to the wind as it twisted through pine needles, to the tide's rhythmic sigh, to the conversations of leaves brushing against one another. They realized that understanding does not always require speaking, that guidance can be offered without command, and that the most profound courage is sometimes found in the patient presence of one's own steady heartbeat amidst the larger currents of the world. The island itself seemed to respond, as if noticing the careful balance they had struck. Waves curled gently along the shore, gulls lifted in slow arcs, and the stars above blinked with an almost conspiratorial softness, as though acknowledging that the story was no longer only a tale of challenge, but also one of quiet stewardship. And so, Irene and Aryan moved through days and nights in a serene cadence, their lives entwined not only with one another, but with the very pulse of the land and sea. They became, in essence, part of the island's slow, enduring song, a song without urgency, without clamor, but with a gentle insistence that nurtures growth, understanding, and peace. Visitors who would later find themselves on the paths they once walked sensed this harmony immediately. A warmth in the soil, a soft murmur in the reeds, a subtle invitation to slow, to observe, and to let the world unfold in its own quiet rhythm. And in this way, the legacy of Irene and Aryan, while not spoken of in grand gestures or heroic epics, became the living, breathing myth of the island itself, a tale meant to be experienced, not in haste, but in the soft unfolding of each day, each breath, each gentle step toward understanding, balance, and rest. As the final hours of twilight descended upon the island, the air thickened with a sense of calm that seemed to cradle every stone, leaf, and ripple of water in its gentle embrace. The world outside had begun to fade, leaving only the soft symphony of waves brushing against the shore, wind whispering through pine branches, and the distant song of nightbirds greeting the darkened sky. Irene and Aryan, now familiar with every hidden cove and winding path, walked slowly along the ridge, hands brushing against one another, feeling the steady heartbeat of the land beneath their feet. The sapling they had nurtured now stood with quiet pride, its leaves catching the last threads of amber light before nightfall, a living reminder of patience, care, and the passage of time. Lanterns flickered gently along the shoreline, their warm glow mirrored in the shallow pools left behind by the retreating tide, and the island itself seemed to inhale, settling into a rhythm that had been slow, deliberate, and enduring across countless generations. Every creature, from the smallest insects weaving through the underbrush to the foxes slipping silently between shadows, moved with a natural ease, as though the presence of the two caretakers had awakened a profound balance that had long been whispered of, but rarely understood. Irene paused at the water's edge, letting the tide curl softly around her ankles, her gaze tracing the horizon where the last sliver of sun lingered, then dissolved entirely into twilight. Aryan knelt beside her, gathering a handful of sand, letting it sift slowly through his fingers, each grain a small reminder of impermanence and the beauty that arises when moments are allowed to flow without force or interruption. The village behind them hummed faintly, fires crackling in hearths, voices muffled in the warmth of homes that seemed to embrace every inhabitant with an unspoken reassurance. Even from a distance, the rhythm of daily life had slowed, echoing the gentle cadence Irene and Aryan had cultivated, a rhythm that did not demand attention but simply existed, inviting those willing to notice, to breathe, and to rest. As darkness deepened, stars began to appear one by one, winking softly across the velvet sky. Their reflections shimmered across the gentle waves, each point of light a delicate reminder that even in the vast expanse of night, there exists a connection, an unbroken thread linking every being, every story, every heartbeat to the larger pulse of the universe. Irene and Aryan walked back toward the small chapel at the heart of the ridge, the familiar path now imbued with a quiet reverence that seemed to pulse in tune with their own calm breathing. Inside, the carved stones and small tokens of care, smooth driftwood, carefully tended herbs, and tiny lanterns, glowed faintly in the lingering warmth of evening light, inviting reflection without demand, offering comfort without words. They lingered for a moment, allowing silence to fill every corner, each sound of the night pressing softly against their ears like a gentle lullaby. The wind stirred lightly, carrying with it the scents of salt and pine, of earth and quiet rain, wrapping around them as an unseen embrace. Here, in this sacred stillness, Irene and Aryan understood that their journey, though now reaching a gentle pause, was not about endings, but continuity. The continuation of care, of observation, of gentle stewardship that would ripple outward, touching the lives of those who came after, those who wandered along the same ridges and coves, those who simply noticed the soft patterns of nature unfolding without interruption. With a final glance toward the horizon, where the sky deepened into indigo and silver, they allowed themselves to settle fully into the embrace of night. Their footsteps softened, their hearts slowed, and a profound serenity took hold, the kind that seeps into bones and breath alike, reminding every listener that rest is not absence but presence. Presence with the world, with one's own heartbeat, and with the quiet wonder that exists in every moment, if only it is observed. As the island exhaled alongside them, waves and wind and stars moving together in a slow, infinite rhythm, Irene and Aryan sat quietly, their minds uncluttered, their spirits at ease, and the story itself seemed to dissolve gently into the night, leaving only a lingering warmth, a whisper of comfort, and the enduring invitation to breathe, to dream, and to drift effortlessly into sleep, knowing that the world, in all its subtle beauty, continues its eternal, soothing dance. The gentle tides and soft moonlight carried the promise of tomorrow, unhurried, untroubled, yet full of potential, and every quiet listener, wherever they lay, could feel the tender cadence of life itself, steady and enduring, a lullaby not sung by a single voice but by the collective breath of the world, embracing all who listen, carrying them slowly, gently, into the calmest rest. In this perfect hush, with night wrapping every hill, every tree, every ripple, and every story in soft shadow, one could finally surrender fully to sleep, carried on the tranquil waves of myth and memory, knowing that as dreams unfold, the lessons of Irene and Aryan, patience, care, and quiet guardianship, continue to weave softly through the world, touching hearts and minds in ways both subtle and eternal.